Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about the natural disruptions to ecosystems and what kind of impact that has on biodiversity. So to start with, these ecosystem disruptions, they can be natural or they can be caused by humans, so anthropogenic. And these natural disruptions can be just as big or even bigger than human-made disruptions. And these disruptions can impact biodiversity. So some ecosystems actually rely on having these natural disruptions in order to really have this variety of living things there. Now, humans have come in and humans have destroyed huge swaths of the environment and could have caused some significant damage. But in this video, we're really focusing in on the natural disruptions, and I want to tell you why here on this next slide. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis states that some ecosystems that are experiencing intermediate levels of disturbance are actually more biodiverse than those with high disturbance or low. And that's because the ecosystems with low levels of disturbance, that allows things to progress and we start to see a lot of competition between species. And now that competition leads to a reduction in biodiversity if there are not some kind of random adaptations that are allowing this resource partitioning to take place. If you have high levels of disturbance, that means that sections of the ecosystem are starting to get wiped out and you're not going to have as many niches for these species to occupy. So you want to have that happy medium. Now, in the natural world, the rate of disturbance has a little bit of variation. Now, these earth processes, they can be periodic, episodic, or random. And you need to know a little bit about what each of these terms really means. So periodic means it's following a natural rhythm, and some examples of periodic natural disturbance would be the changing of weather patterns following the seasons, so having that hot and the cold cycles going on. Episodic disturbances, these follow a bit of a known pattern, but it has irregular intervals. So think about volcanoes erupting or earthquakes. Those follow a bit of a pattern, but it's not consistent. It is not knowing that you are going to have that winter, spring, summer, fall at these set intervals. An earthquake happens after the stress builds up over time and then it's released and you have the earthquake. You know that stress is building up. You know if it's been a long time between earthquakes, the next one is coming pretty soon. A totally random ecosystem disturbance would be something like a tornado. Yes, we know tornadoes typically happen in the summertime, particularly in the Midwestern United States. We know that they happen associated with large storms, but we do not know exactly where that tornado is going to come from, and we don't know the path that it's going to take. I mean, hurricanes are much more predictable than a tornado is. So it's important to understand that these disturbances follow some different types of patterns. Now, if you look back into the history of the Earth, these changes in climate have altered ecosystems over time. If we look at the global average temperature, and this graph is only going back about 2,000-ish years, you can see that there's a bit of fluctuation happening. But you can also see that in recent years, we have this significant spike. And we are actually going to spend an entire unit and sprinkled throughout the course talking about what's happening with that big spike. But I want you to focus in on these kind of warm and cold periods. And actually, we're going to zoom out here a little bit. And you can see going back millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, there have been periods when it's been quite a bit warmer and quite a bit colder. And those colder periods of time, those are the historic ice ages. Life as we know it today was not possible during those glacial periods. So over the past history of the Earth, the climate has changed and the ecosystems have changed as a result of that. We can also see some changes during those glacial periods and particularly towards the end of them. I want to focus in here on Glacial Lake, Wisconsin and Glacial Lake, Missoula. Glacial Lake Missoula formed because a very large glacier with the edge positioned right at about the border of Idaho, so the eastern border of the Upper Panhandle, that was blocking up a lot of this meltwater. Now, as that dam from that glacier burst, it suddenly flooded all of western Washington state and part of northern Oregon. And this actually altered those ecosystems because what used to be at the bottom of a lake in Montana is now exposed. So the fish can't really survive there. None of the aquatic organisms can survive now that that lake's been drained. Same thing with Glacial Lake, Wisconsin. That formed in the central plains of the state. Today, that's all agriculture. There's a whole bunch of forest and prairie and grassland ecosystems in that area. But if you go back to the most recent ice age, that was all underwater in a lake. So over time, changes in the global climate have altered what these particular locations look like and the ecosystems that are found there. The sea level has also changed over time. And you'll notice in this particular graph that the periods when the sea level was much higher correspond to the times when the climate was warmer. And the periods when the sea level was lower correspond to the times when we had the glaciation or the ice ages. So that makes sense though, because during an ice age, all of that water is frozen and held in the glaciers, and it's not melted and out in the ocean. And when it's warmer, those glaciers melt and release that water, and it ends up in the ocean. So it makes sense that the sea level is higher when the climate is warmer. And that's pretty scary if you're thinking about the world we live in today. And we'll talk more about that in later sections of this course. But what does all of these changes really mean for habitat? So any disruption to an ecosystem really alters what kind of organism is able to live there. I want to focus in here on the wildfires in Australia that happened in the winter, so the January of 2020 and December 2019. They were hugely devastating to those ecosystems there. This was a large-scale natural disruption. And what we know in ecology is that large-scale disruptions can lead to local species extinction. So we think about the koalas that lived in these vast eucalyptus forests. They're not particularly fast animals. They can't outrun a wildfire. And a lot of the koalas actually burned in that fire. And those that did survive the fire, they no longer have this trees as this food source. They no longer have the shelter. And that's really devastating to the species as a whole. And scientists are really worried that they could become extinct. A small-scale natural disruption, so say instead of those being wide, large-scale wildfires, maybe only 10 or let's say maybe even only 100 acres burned. That smaller disruption would not be big enough to lead to that local species extinction. The koalas probably would have been just fine. They would, some of them would have died in that fire, but the surrounding area would have been able to repopulate it. With such a large-scale disruption, there's not as much of a chance of that population being able to recover. Now, some species of animals have developed some pretty neat ways to deal with periodic or predictable natural disruptions. And this is done primarily through migration. Now, there are two types of migration. There is short-term and long-term. Short-term migration, this is species that are moving with changes of the seasons. So think about songbirds flying south for winter. You can also think about large herbivores, particularly in the plains of Africa, like zebras, are migrating with the wet and dry rainy seasons. So that's short-term migrations, following the annual seasonal cycle. Long-term migrations, these are a little bit bigger. Think about sea turtles. Sea turtles do not do an annual migration back and forth to particular locations. They hatch on a beach, spend most of their life out in the open ocean, but then once they finally reach maturity, which takes many, many years, they return to the beach to lay their eggs. Okay, and then the cycle starts all over again. So a long-term migration is something that extends beyond a year. Salmon are another example of a species that participates in long-term migration. So they hatch in small inland streams, swim out to the ocean, reach maturity, and then return back to that exact same stream to lay their eggs, and then they ultimately die after that. So kind of sad, but also really fascinating that they're able to do such an amazing process. Now, climate change has altered some of these migration patterns. Scientists have found that some bird species are actually spending their winters further north, so they're not having to migrate quite as far. Now, this is a bit alarming because they have been able to measure this movement in a relatively short period of time. So from the 1960s to the early 2000s, some of these species have reduced that distance of their migration pretty significantly. So I think that's kind of interesting to take a note of. So in summary, natural disruptions can happen short-term, long-term impacts on ecosystems, and some of these natural disruptions are pretty big and sometimes even bigger than human-caused disruptions or anthropogenic disruptions. Make sure you understand the word anthropogenic. I'm not really going to define it probably again in this course, so make sure you know what it means. Also, make sure you understand Earth processes are periodic, episodic, or random. And the climate and sea level have changed in the past, they'll continue changing in the future, but humans are actually accelerating and messing around and altering some of this change. Again, talk about that more later in the course. And a lot of these environmental changes are altering habitat, obviously, and wildlife has to figure out ways to deal with this. And one of the ways that they deal with all of these natural changes is to do migration, both on the short term and the long term. Whew, that was a lot of information. I hope that you took good notes. Please send me your questions and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.